suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt in flutter, in there stepped a stately raven. The raven is my talisman. Curious talisman, the symbol of death. Death is my talisman. Can a horror movie ever be too scary? In 1935, they certainly thought so with The Raven. It was considered so frightening, so degrading, and so much of a shock to their nervous system that Hollywood stopped making horror movies because of it. Now, when you watch The Raven today, those very aspects make it a ghoulishly groovy time. In 1845, Edgar Allan Poe published a poem about a man descending into madness because of the loss of his love Lenore. Titled The Raven, he only made about $10 from it, but it became his most famous poem. And in the swinging summer of 1934, Universal Studios began planning an adaptation of The Raven for their number 1 and their number 2 horror stars, Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. In 1931, Lugosi's Dracula and Karloff's Frankenstein defined the horror genre in American cinema and launched a horror boom at Universal and at other studios. In 1934, Karloff and Lugosi starred in their first movie together, the horror masterpiece The Black Cat, which was a very, very, very loose adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's short story. It was a huge hit, and The Raven would be a natural follow-up. As all movies had to do, Universal had to submit the script and photos of Boris Karloff's makeup to the censoring body known as the Production Code Office, which was run by Joseph Breen. Along with giving them specific instructions of what not to do, Joseph Breen gave them this warning. We deem it necessary to remind you that because of the stark realism of numerous elements in your story, you are running the risk of excessive horror. The photos they showed Breen were actually of a toned-down version of the makeup, and not what appears in the film. And Universal decided to ignore his warning. When The Raven was released, the reviews were disastrous. Time magazine said it was stuffed with horrors to the point of absurdity. The London Times called it horror for horror's sake, and the Hamburg Post Advocate said if you took a child to see it, it would be an outrage to their nervous system, and you could warp them for life. I hope my nephew sees it on Spenguli. In some places, like New York and Ohio, different shots had to be cut out before it was allowed to be shown. And in other places, like Ontario, Canada, Holland, and China, it was banned completely. In England, which was a huge market, the British Board of Censors decreed that The Raven would be the final horror movie that they would approve, and henceforth, horror movies would be banned in England. In the US, other horror movies failed at the box office because of The Raven's reputation. And just like in mythology, The Raven would be the bird of death for horror movies. Jean Thatcher has a car accident and is near death, but her father, Judge Thatcher, begs Dr. Vallon to save her life. Dr. Vallon is an accomplished surgeon whose passion is Edgar Allan Poe and the torture he describes in his stories. He saves Jean, but also falls in love with her, but Judge Thatcher tells him to stay away. The criminal Edmund Bateman goes to Dr. Vallon asking for plastic surgery, partially so that he won't be recognized, but also because he reasons that his own ugliness causes him to do ugly things. Dr. Vallon agrees and does change Bateman's face by making it even worse, and will only make Bateman handsome if he commits murder and torture. Dr. Vallon has a party at his home with Jean, Judge Thatcher, and some other guests, and they have no idea that they are in for an evening of torture. Torture that was inspired by Edgar Allan Poe. The previous Karloff and Lugosi film, The Black Cat, was just as dark as The Raven, but it was more artistic and had substance, whereas all The Raven wants to do is be scary. Now, that's what got it into trouble, but it's also what makes it so good, because it is the 1935 equivalent of a splatter film. Splatter films, or as they're sometimes called, torture porn, are movies that are more about the graphic violence and seeing people get killed or tortured than the actual plot. And while the storyline here is decent, that's the Raven all over. My dinner's ready. In the opening credits, Karloff and Lugosi, two names that were synonymous with terror, are billed by just their last names, and in this humongous font, so right away you know you're in for over-the-top scares. Originally, there was an opening scene where we meet and learn about Jean Thatcher, but it was cut, so the movie opens with a car crash. Usually horror movies of this era take their time to build atmosphere and characters, so it's an exciting change to see it just open with a bang. Afterwards, there's enough character and plot scenes for the story to make sense, but it's clearly more about the scary set pieces. There's this scene where Dr. Valen operates on Bateman, and the last 20 minutes of this only an hour-long movie is all about Dr. Valen torturing his guests. There's all these torture devices and traps, and it's so suspenseful as Judge Thatcher is looking terrified as the pendulum swings and gets closer and closer, while the sadistic Valen is gleefully toying with him.
What's that thing?
A knife.
Well, what's it doing?
Descending.
What are you trying to do to me?
Torture you.
Try to be sane, Valen.
I am the sanest man who ever lived, but I will not be tortured. I tear torture from myself by torturing you. 15 minutes. Torture waiting. Do you mind if I smoke? It's spooktacular. Now, because it is 1935 and Universal Studios, you get that great shadowy black and white photography. And instead of a bunch of teenagers running around, you get experienced character actors giving it dramatic weight. However, because it's as graphic as they could go, without the blood and gore of today, there's this innocent fun about the scariness. And the director, Lou Landers, had previously done serials, and his serials were like early superhero movies for kids. So he has a flair for action, crazy gadgets, and the outrageous. And the movie comes across as this really great horror comic book come to life. That is, a horror comic book that happens to star the two greatest icons of the genre, Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. Boris Karloff, who always got top billing and more money than Bela Lugosi, These Bites, was originally set to play Dr. Valen. But for whatever reason, perhaps because Universal thought that just like in Frankenstein, Boris would steal the show with a scary makeup, they had them switch roles. And I'm so glad, because Dr. Valen is the ultimate Bela Lugosi character. Dr. Valen is a brilliant yet mad surgeon whose passions are the writings of Edgar Allan Poe, the torture described in Poe's stories, and the lovely Jean Thatcher, who's Valen's personification of the Raven's lost Lenore. Dr. Valen lives in a spooky-looking mansion that's even spookier than a thunderstorm. And in his basement, he has built the torture devices that Poe described in his tales. Lugosi said, if you are not serious, people will sense it. And indeed, he takes on this larger-than-life character of Dr. Valen like a frightening dark force of nature. You're an extraordinary man. Almost not a man. Almost a god. A god with the taint of human emotions. Just like with Dracula, Bela brings a romantic element to the character. Hiya, Pookie. His eyes are at his most intense. I especially love it when he's operating, where it's a mixture of attraction and fascination with pain and death. Now, when he's torturing, he's completely mad, relishing his own sadism with his great crazy laugh. Plus, in his wonderful Hungarian accent, he has one fantastically spooky line after the other. What torture! What a delicious torture, Bateman! Greater than Poe! I have done it, Bateman! Poe, you are avenged! Bela Lugosi had an acting style all his own. He learned to act on the Hungarian stage. At the National Theatre of Budapest, they had a ranking system, and at one point he was ranked number 1. But it was also a very old-fashioned style of acting that focused on vocal intonation and facial expressions, as opposed to working from the inside out. And people do criticize him for it, especially with The Raven. And Boris Karloff felt this was part of the reason for the downfall of Bela's career. However, he combines that technique with infusing aspects of his own personality into the role, like his charisma and his moodiness. And he gets into character with a method acting like intensity. So his performance seems natural for him, but unnatural from anyone else. And he comes across as a living nightmare, which is still scary and perfect for this story. Giving balance to Bela's more theatrical performance is Boris Karloff's more subtle performance as Bateman. Bateman is a criminal who wants to start a new life by having plastic surgery. But Dr. Vaughn has other plans.
Do I look different?
Yes.
I want to see myself.
Alright, just wait here. You're monstrously ugly. Your monstrous ugliness breeds a monstrous hate. Good. I love the reveal of Bateman's face, with him looking at his reflection in all the mirrors. It's like a twisted funhouse, especially with Vaughn laughing. As always at Universal Studios, Jack Pierce did the makeup. He used beeswax and cellophane to create the fake eye, and it's groovily ghoulish. As usual, Boris had his eye on exploring the depth of the character, and you do feel for this tortured soul who wants to do good, but is always in a situation where he has to be bad. Now, sympathetic and scary was the winning Karloff formula. But because this role is smaller, and consequently not as developed, the dialogue does have a few clunky moments. But Boris smooths them over with some terrific tongue-in-cheek delivery.
The cashier tried to get me into trouble. He took his gag out of his mouth and started yelling for the police. I had a saddling torch in my hand.
So you put the burning torch into his face, into his eyes.
Well, sometimes you can't help things like that.
Boris Karloff didn't really like this movie. In fact, one morning, Ian Wolfe, who played Pinky, was there early, and Boris was there early for makeup, and Ian Wolfe asked him, "Mr. Karloff, could you please direct me to the toilet?" And Boris replied, "The whole place is a toilet." Along with this deadly duo, there are also some comedy relief characters that some feel actually take away from the movie.
He's always trying to get free medical advice. The other evening we met Dr. Thayer, and he turned out to be a veterinary.
He gave me some very good advice about my dogs. I actually like them. I think Bela staring at them blankly whenever they say something hokey is really funny. Plus, they're so annoying that it puts you strangely on Bela.Lugosi's side, where you enjoy seeing him be mean to them. Along with the cast giving the movie potential, so does the fact that The Raven is an early meta-horror film. Meta-horror is a type of horror film that is self-referential to the horror genre. Scream is a perfect example. And where Scream homages the slasher films that inspired it, The Raven homages some of the 19th century horror literature that inspired some of the Universal horror movies, focusing, of course, on the works of Edgar Allan Poe. Just like Billy and Stu become killers because they love slasher movies, Dr. Vaughn becomes a torturer because he loves Edgar Allan Poe. They recite lines from the poem. Jean does a swinging interpretive dance of the Raven. They include the pendulum from The Pit in the Pendulum. And there's a figure of a raven seen throughout the film. Universal seemed to have trouble adapting Poe's stories faithfully, but this movie works as a great tribute to him. The movie also references Boris's and Bela's most iconic characters. At one point, you hear Boris's Frankenstein growl, and the idea that a work of literature can become such a part of Dr. Vaughn's life parallels how Dracula became such a part of Bela Lugosi's life, especially in regards to his public persona. It practically became part of his name, with him often being billed as Dracula himself or Bela Dracula Lugosi. Meta horror is so much fun for horror fans because it references all the things we love. And by acknowledging other horror movies, or in this case stories, it sets it more in the real world, which goes back to Joseph Green's original warning. The financial disaster of The Raven, the banning of horror films in England, and the Lumleys, the founding family of Universal Studios, losing the studio, led to the end of Universal monster movies and the horror boom in Hollywood. Because he was typecast in horror roles, Bela Lugosi couldn't find a job. In 1941, he told the Hollywood Citizens News about the experience. "The mortgage company got my house. I sold one car and then the other. I borrowed where I could, but who considered a jobless spook a good risk? By the end of 1937, I was at my wit's end. My wife was about to have a baby, and we didn't have anything to eat. I was forced to go on relief." In fact, when Bela did have his son, he had to apply for help to the Motion Picture Relief Fund to pay the hospital bills. Boris weathered this storm better, but still went 7 months without a movie, and when he was working at Warner Brothers, Jack Warner was embarrassed to be making Boris Karloff movies. Then on August 4th, 1938, the Los Angeles Regina Theater had nothing else to show, so they did a triple feature of Dracula, Frankenstein, and Son of Kong. The audience loved it, and it led to a national-wide release of the double feature of Dracula and Frankenstein, and horror was back. Initially, Universal was going to reteam Karloff and Lugosi in a remake of The Raven, but ended up teaming them in a Frankenstein sequel instead. A whole new cycle of Universal monster movies was launched, but as great as some of them were, they were never as daring as the ones made in their early 30s. The Raven is such a fun horror movie to watch, and for Bela Lugosi fans, it's a rare moment where he actually gets the better part instead of Boris Karloff. So I hope I don't ruffle your feathers by giving it 4 mad surgeons out of 4. Thank you for watching Dusty Old Movies, and have a torturous day.